Okay, very simple. And to navigate around is simply a matter of holding Alt and then left mouse button and just drag it around. Okay, this allows you to dolly around or orbit around the scene. You can use your middle mouse button with the Alt press down to pan, and then right mouse button to zoom in and out, okay, or track in and out. If you hold Alt, left mouse button, and middle mouse button, you can also track in and out. And once you get that, you'll be able to navigate around your scene fairly easily, okay? Alright, let's just go ahead and begin the menus. All the menus are up here. Most of them are quite intuitive. Some of them are very obscure, and a lot of them, if you're learning Maya, may not make a lot of sense unless you do a lot of 3D in general, okay? So this is where you find all of your stuff. You have a box over here. If you click it, you can actually switch between different menus here, but honestly, the fastest way to navigate around those things is simply go to your viewport right here, just mouse over it and hold your spacebar. This brings up what's called the hotbox, and this gives you everything that you need, okay? Every menu item that's available inside of Maya. Now, if you can't see as many options here, all you really have to do is just go to hotbox controls and just make sure you go to show all, okay? So hold down the mouse on hotbox controls, show all, or you can hide all. It's up to you, really. Typically I don't do that. I like to make sure I have everything. So here are all the options here. You can even create your polygons, your lights, everything that you actually need. Next thing I want to show you is something called marking menus. Now, marking menus are similar to what you see in the hotboxes, okay? So these are just basically marking menus, but you can create your own marking menus yourself. There are tutorials to teach you how to do that, but just to be very clear, if you just let's say we create a polygon sphere, okay? And then we right click, you can see we've got marking menus. Just hold the right click down, and then you can get a few other options that you can use as well. Okay, you can also hold shift, right click to get something different. Over time, you'll memorize some of these tools, okay, especially if you're going to be using them fairly often. I've got my own marking menus, but you don't have to follow that if you don't want to. So marking menus just basically give you very quick access to certain tools that you need, okay? After you are ready to work, the next thing you actually need to do is set your project. Now, if you go to File, go down here and go to your Set Project, or Control K with your hotkey. And what this will do is basically bring you to, well, you have to set your project up, but bring you to a point where you can create a folder where all of the elements get saved into, okay? So, for example, if I go to my desktop, typically I don't save stuff on my desktop, but we go to my desktop and I go to New Folder, and I'm going to call this my Maya project. And I go Select Folder. What this will do is we'll create a folder inside the desktop, okay? And I'm going to go create default workspace. Now, right now, not much really happens, okay? So let's just go to my folder over here. You can see on my desktop, we've got my project. Now in here, there's really nothing to be said, okay? So I'm going to move this to the side for a second. Let's go back into File, and let's go back into Project Window. Now, remember that folder that we've created? Well, what this will do now is actually create a bunch of folders, default folders, where you can actually save your scene, okay? So this is primarily only for keeping your projects nice and tidy. I highly recommend everyone do this for whatever project they do so that you don't get lost. But you can see here we've got scenes, templates, images, all these folders here. This is kind of like Maya's default method, okay? So let's just go to Accept, and what this will do, if I were to go to my Maya folder over here, whoops, is it will create folders inside your Maya project folder. So all of the scenes that you'll save will end up here. You can say like rendered images will pop up in images here. You can save your sounds here, all that. This is just file structure, really. So you don't have to follow the same way, but I recommend sticking with the default. So that's basically it for the very initial stages of Maya. Once you get that down, the rest comes quite naturally, okay? Polygons, the most commonly used thing. We can create squares or cubes here. If I hold shift, you can play around with that as well. Or you can just drag it out once and then click it again to create the height of your polygon, okay? Now to view your scene, you can press 4, 5, or 6. 4, 5, and 6 basically run through the view mode. If you go to 4, this is the wire mesh mode, okay? 5 is simply, as you see here, it's just a simple shaded mode. 6, but you can't really see it, is actually texture mode, okay? And 7, if you press 7, This is lighting mode, so if I were to just very quickly create a light, so I'll just go ahead and create a point light. You can see that you can go to lighting mode right here. Okay, so this is our Omni light. Move it around. As you can see, go between 4, 5, 6, and 7. You can have a play around with that. Now, the other thing is, if you've got an object here, you can actually smooth your object. Okay, so pressing 1, 2, and 3 allows you to switch between the smoothing of your object that you have selected. Okay, so if you had like double and you've only like did it on one, it's not going to do it for anything else. Okay, now smoothing is primarily used to just gauge your model in and of itself. You typically don't use 1, 2, and 3 to get final model results. Okay, so if you wanted to smooth the cube, for example, you would have to go to mesh and then you go smooth mode. Okay, well, there are other options down there, but I'm not going to get into that. I'll just do that again. I'll just bring the options box by pressing the square. I'm going to go ahead and reset the buttons. So there you go. That's how you typically smooth an object. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3, I usually don't touch that. I only use it for modeling purposes so that I can get an idea of what the model actually looks like. Okay, pressing W, E, and R allows you to go between the move tools. Okay, so W is the translate. You can go onto the middle square right here to just move it based on your camera view, or you can go ahead and move it based on the arrows. Okay, quite straightforward. E is rotate. Again, same deal. You can also do it on this ring here on the outside. And then you've got R, which is a scale. And scale allows you to, well, basically do that, all right? Component mode. Now, if you were to go to your object here, and component mode is one of the other very common things that you'll be using inside of Maya. If you press F8, this switches you in and out of component mode, okay? Component mode basically allows you to move the vertices and the faces around, and the same tools apply, okay? So if you go W, E, and R, it allows you to go between these little segments here. Okay, very, very simple. You can also select, marquee select like several vertices and then rotate or scale it to your liking, okay? And again, you go between your views to just, gauge your model, see what it's like, and then have a play around with that. So that's typically how component mode goes. Now, if you want to select faces, just simply hold your cursor around your model, hold right click, and then just drag down to the marking menu where it says face. Okay, and from here, you can actually now move the faces around. You can rotate, you can scale. You can also go to, for example, an edge. If you just want to select an edge, it does the same thing. All right, and then we'll go back to vertex, and this will allow us to play around with that. All right. What I want to do is show you how to create a mirror cube. Now, a mirror cube is one of the most basic startup modeling parts. Actually, I'll just show you. A mirror cube is quite simple. I'll just go ahead and create a square here. Now, I'm going to scale this up. Now down here you've got the channel box. This allows you to make some edits. For example, if you want to input some values of your scale X, Y, and Z, you can do that. Okay. Down here we've got inputs. Now if you don't have any inputs here, chances are you have create history or construction history off. Okay, so if we go up here, you can see we've got construction history on and off. Just make sure that is on before you create your cube. Okay, so we just that's actually on already, but I'll leave that there. And from here, I'm going to change the subdivision to 2. Now, if we go back to my normal highlighted view, you can see that we've got our mesh right here. Now, I just want to hold X, and this basically allows you to snap onto the grid. One other thing I do need to show you is like a curve, so don't worry about what I'm doing right here. I'm just creating a curve. You can actually move on curves as well, okay, or edges. So if we were to hold C, you can see that it changes into a circle, and if I were to middle mouse drag on the curve, you can see that this will move the pivot or snap it onto the curve itself, or edge if you have a polygon. All right, so another thing that's quite ideal if you need to get some proper details down. And from here I'm going to go to component mode, right click, go to face, delete one side. All right, and if you were to say, for example, I want to flip it, duplicate and flip it to the other side, you'd be right. And what we can do is we can go to the menu, or we'll just go to the hotbox. I'm going to go to edit, I'm going to go to duplicate special, and you can see there's a little box here on the right side. This brings up a window, okay? This goes for just about anything else. So this brings up an options window, and what I'm going to do is, let's first just reset the settings, and I'm going to create an instance. Let's go to scale, which basically represents X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to go to -1. Number of copies is 1, and then I'm just going to click apply. Okay, we can also close that. Now if I were to, for example, edit one side, so I'll go to my vertex here, you can see that it will affect the other. Now this is the most basic way to model a character. Okay, so the traditional methods use this technique. So you start with a mirror cube, and then you start splitting your cube into higher and higher resolutions as you start fleshing out these the details, but typically these days a lot of people use sculpting tools like ZBrush and Mudbox, okay, to get high res results. So ideal if you want to learn some low poly modeling, but generally this technique is a little bit obsolete. A lot of people use sculpting tools, but this is simply how you create a mirror cube to get started. Okay, now to split your model, you just hold Shift down, and you want to bring up your I gotta get out of the component mode, I'm sorry. So hold Shift and right click, and down here we've got on the side, hang on, I'll just go back here. So down to the left side you can see we've got split. Okay, there are other tools here that you can go ahead and play around, but I'm just going to go to split, and I'm going to go to split polygon tool. Now split polygon tool basically allows you to cut around your edges. Okay, so you click on the edges like so, and then press enter to commit. And once you commit, you can see because it's a mirror cube, it affects the other side. And then from here, what you do is you start adding detail to your character. So this is how you create like more and more detail for whatever character you want to do. Now there are other things that you need to take into account, for example edge flow. I'm not going to get into that, but this is simply how you use the tool. Another thing is if you want to repeat the last tool that you used, you just simply press G. Okay, so pressing G will repeat the last tool that you want, and then we'll just go ahead and reuse it again. Okay, so same deal. Over here you can see we've got a bunch of inputs. Over time, as you start like adding more and more detail to your character right here, so if I were just to do this, your input output is going to get pretty messy. Okay, so for us to delete this or keep it clean, okay, it's very simple. All we have to do is go to edit. Let's go into delete all by type and then history. This will keep it nice and clean. Okay, so as you model, you get better. You don't want this flooding with so many different modifiers. You want to keep it nice and clean as you create your character or create your project. All right, so that's simply how you use the split tool, polygon split tool. You just simply hold Shift. If you ever have trouble finding it, you can always go to your hotbox right here and then just search around for where it might be. Generally it's quite intuitive, so for example if I wanted to edit the mesh, I just simply go to edit mesh and then go to interactive split tool, okay, which is kind of similar to what you saw before, except this one's a little bit more interactive, I guess. Okay, so you can access the tools in many different ways, but I prefer just to use the marking menu method. Alright, now that you see how to split this model, you can see that it's actually looking a little bit too faceted, okay, and which is natural when you're creating a model from scratch. So what I want to do is actually I want to smooth or harden the edges. So to do that, just go to your hotbox, let's go to normals, and I'm just going to harden edge. Harden edge basically hardens everything around, okay, so you don't get any smoothing, so you get all these nice faceted segments. Now some people like to model in this fashion because it allows you to actually see where the edges actually are. But typically I like to go to normals and then soften the edges because I like to get a very good smooth view. Okay, so it's dependent upon how you actually work. You can see down the middle we've got a bit of a split here. That's because the models aren't merged yet, but that's something we do a little bit later. And I'm going to go ahead and clean this up by going Shift Alt D to clean up the inputs. Okay, the next thing I want to cover is something called the outliner. Now if we go to our hotbox, let's just go to Window and then Outliner. Remember, if you have any hotkeys assigned to any of the tools inside of Maya, you can see them over here. So we have it on Alt O, so I'm just going to go ahead and click this. And the outliner is basically your projects tab. What this holds is all the objects inside your scene that you have here. We've got 3 spheres, okay? So you can see we've got 1, 2, 3. And another thing that you might also want to use is actually something called grouping or parenting. Okay, so for example, if we wanted to group these three together, I can just go to my outliner, or I can select them inside my viewport, and then I'll just go Control G. Now it's very important that you learn the hotkeys as fast as you can, because if you start learning your hotkeys, you actually won't lose momentum while you're working, okay? Which is very important in terms of like psychologically speaking, because you will stay motivated, you'll keep momentum up, and then you'll end up being very productive, okay? But if you're always constantly going into like the menu buttons or going to your hot box here, it gets a little bit tiring, okay? So always start learning your hotkeys as soon as possible, and it doesn't take long. It takes like 30 seconds for you to just go to the help file, go to my help, and search up some hotkeys, and then have that inside your brain, okay? So that next time you don't have to go the long way whenever you're searching, or whenever you're looking for a particular tool, okay? So Control G is simply to group your selected scenes, and then you can see in the outliner we've got a group node. Now the group node doesn't really render or anything, it's just a node, it's empty, it's completely blank. What it does is it just holds everything inside. So group nodes are very important when it comes down to rigging a little bit later. That's a bit advanced to be covering in this tutorial, but this is something that you can at least understand for now, okay? Just keep it inside your head. The other thing is, if I were to just grab these spheres and then middle mouse drag it outside of that group node, okay? You can see I can drag it out above the group. You can see I've got the group node right here, and I can go ahead and delete that, okay? And then one thing you can do is actually parent objects together, okay? So you're creating a hierarchy. Now you got two ways of doing this. You can do it inside your viewport. Just select the object and then shift select the parent, okay, like that, and then press P. When you do that, what happens is the sphere, the parent sphere, well, it becomes the parent, and now you can actually move everything that's inside that parent sphere. If you go into the outliner, you can see that if we were to just expand this, we've got a P sphere shape 2, that's just the shape of the sphere, the polygon, and then we've got the sphere, the third sphere right here, okay? So this is underneath sphere number 2. So anytime you select number 2, you will select all the child nodes underneath it, okay? Now Shift P, if I were to select that or select both of them, Shift P basically is the opposite, okay? So you're deparenting anything that's inside. So very important, very useful tool to understand, because later on when you start rigging, you're going to do a lot, you're going to deal with a lot of parenting, hierarchies, and group noding, okay? So that's one way. You can actually middle mouse drag it into the sphere here, like here. So if I were to grab number 2 and put it into number 1, and you can see now it is now parented to number 1, okay? And I can do the same with sphere number 3, so I'll just drag it to number 1. But what if I actually wanted it underneath number 2, okay? So if I were to, for example, rotate number 2, I can, rotate number 3. All we have to do is, you can, do it inside the viewport again, but I'm just going to do it inside the outliner. Just drag and drop it into sphere number 2, okay? So that's the basics of hierarchies. Now, remember, hierarchies will get complicated later on, okay? So that's not something you want to worry about at this stage, but it is an important tool for you to at least understand for now, okay? So that's the basics of hierarchies. Now, animation is quite straightforward for those who know how to create keyframes, but in terms of animating characters, that's actually another beast altogether. So animation in Maya is quite robust, okay? It's got all the tools, most of the tools that you actually need. I know in later versions or newer versions of Maya, there are more tools, more features when it comes to animation, okay? So first things first, let's just go ahead and animate one of these cubes, okay? So say P cube number 1. And say I wanted to move it from here to here. It's actually very simple. Down here we've got the timeline. Over here we've got the slider. This goes between the timeline that you can have a play around. You can even click the end of the square to expand the timeline. If you want it longer in terms of framing, you can go to the inside here and then type, say, if I wanted a 500 frame result, you can go ahead and do that. You can do it on the other side as well. Typically I like to leave it at frame number 1, but you can go to frame 0. So if I go frame 0, you can do that. Once again, you can play around with the time slider if you just want to zoom in and out so that you can see the keyframes in a better fashion, okay? So it's just easier for you to just read it. But if we want to create keyframes on our scene, I'm going to go down to maybe 150 frames for now. It's a very simple matter of just holding Shift and then W, E, or R, okay? So if I hold Shift and W, this will translate the X, Y, Z, okay? And let me just move to maybe frame 30, and then I'll just move it over here. And you can see on the timeline, we've got 2 keyframes that have been created automatically. Now, if these keyframes have not been created, you can go Shift W on the end result right here. So if I were to go, say, frame 45 and then move it here and then Shift W again, it will create another keyframe, okay? But if you can't get those automatic keyframes, then you can just go down to the bottom right and you see auto keyframe toggle. Just make sure that's on. Some animators prefer it on, some prefer it off. In general, I like to keep it on just to make things a little bit easier. So you can play around and toggle with that based on how you're animating and how you like to sort your keyframes out, okay? So that's how you animate the translate. Now, from frame 45 to frame 60, I'm going to, well, let's start at frame 45. I'm going to keyframe rotate, okay? You can use Shift E to keyframe all 3, but say if I wanted to only keyframe just one, well, I would just go ahead and right click and then key selected, okay? So rotate X. And then that has created a key on frame 45. I'll go to frame 60. Let's just set it to 45, okay? Oops, 45. I can go ahead and do that, and then just keyframe selected again if you want, if it hasn't created a keyframe, and you can see that it's already done some animation right here. Now from frame, say frame 70, I'm going to leave a bit of a blank space. I'm going to keyframe scale X, Y, and Z. Let me go ahead and lock some of these attributes, okay? I'm going to lock scale, let me lock scale X and Z, okay? So Control, click, and let me just right click, and down here, I can go ahead and lock selected. Now, why would you want to lock a selection? Well, in general, when it comes to rigging, for example, and you want to limit what the animators do in their rigs, sometimes it's appropriate for you to actually lock some of the attributes so that the animators don't get confused, okay? This is especially true when you've got controls on your rigs that you want them to work in a very specific manner. But basically, when you lock it, it doesn't allow you to create keyframes, okay? I can go ahead and key select it on these 2 and nothing will happen. Or I can go ahead and just go Shift R, and it will only create a keyframe on scale Y. So I'm going to go to frame 90 and then maybe just click it and then middle mouse drag inside the viewport, okay? So middle mouse drag inside the viewport, and then it's created a keyframe right there. So we can do some very basic animation like this. So we can got the movement, we've got the rotation, and then we've got the scale. All right. And then for you to play, you can go ahead and play backwards or forwards right here. I've actually got my hotkey set to Control Spacebar, but you can go ahead and set your own hotkeys. Now that's actually playing a little bit quickly. So let's go to our animation preferences. So just next to the auto keyframe toggle, you can see there's another box right here called preferences. Okay, so let's just go ahead and open this up. And this brings up the preferences window. If you go down to the time slider, you can see we've got playback speed on play every frame. Now, I would use play every frame when you're doing simulation like cloth, but in this case, we're doing it in real time. So let's go 24 frames per second and just go ahead and save, and then we'll go ahead and play this. Okay, you can see that it plays at a normal speed now, 24 FPS. Okay, so that's what Maya will do in general, and you can just go ahead, play, and stop and scrub your timeline to get a read on your animation. I'm going to go back into the preferences here. Say you don't actually want it to be 24 FPS. Maybe you want it to be 29, okay, or 25 FPS. Go to the settings on the categories here, and then just go to time, and then you've got a bunch of settings right here that you can actually play around with, okay? You can set your own as well. Okay, 30 FPS for NTSC, PAL is 25, that's for European nations. I'm in Australia, so we actually have 25. Film for cinema screen is 24, and then you got 15 FPS if you want to do like cartoonish kind of animations, okay? So that's just some of the settings you can play around here. I'm just going to leave it at 24. I'm not going to bother changing that. There are lots of other settings here that you can play around with. I'm not going to go through them, but you can have a play around and take a look at that yourself in your own time. The other thing is over here, we've got under cameras, you've got far clip. This basically tells you how far you can see inside your viewport, okay? So I typically like to leave it around 10,000, but if you have a really big scene, you might want to crank it up to 100K or 200K. Play around with that. You can also edit that inside your cameras, inside the cameras in your scene as well. The next thing I want to show you is the animation graph editor. So we've got some keyframes in our timeline, but what if you actually need to do some fine tuning, okay? And this is very common. This is a very common tool for a lot of animators over here. If we go to Window, go to animation editors and go to graph editor. What you will bring up is a little window with a bunch of, well, basically the graph editor. Okay, so this is essentially where all the keyframes are shown in their entirety. You can see how the curves are functioning. If we were to go over here, let me just go here and then say the scale segment, so frame 70 to 90. You can see we've got the scale Y. Okay, p cube, scale Y. We can actually play around with this. Okay, so you navigate inside here just as you would inside your viewport. Okay, so hold Alt, zoom in and out. Obviously you can't dolly, so it's just really middle mouse button and then right mouse button to zoom in and out. You can also hold Shift and Alt to, hold Shift, and then you can hold middle mouse and left mouse button, Shift and Alt, middle mouse, left mouse button to go expanded left or up and down. Okay, so this will give you some nice views. The other thing is you can also use F and A to view certain points. For example, if you were to highlight this segment and press F, it will frame it up to fill the entire screen. Okay, so same deal over here. Okay, but typically I like to just learn the basic navigation of Maya first before I start playing around with this. So we have movement here. We can play around with the setting. You can see it's actually affecting the size of it if we go up. So if I were to hold Shift and go up, or you can just middle mouse drag that around and then adjust your graph to your liking. Okay, another thing is you can also play around with the tangents here. These tangents allow you to get some nice curves. Okay, so for example, if you wanted to sort of slowly grow like this, so that's how you play around with that. You just select it and then middle mouse drag that little tangent right there. So that's basics of animation using animation graph. Now when you get into the more advanced prospects of animation, you can actually play around with the tracks editor. Now the tracks editor, I'm not going to get into this, but it basically allows you to save clips of animation, so you can actually loop animation, like animation cycles, walk cycles and such. There's also something called the dope sheet, so the top right hand corner. This is great for animators to create like keyframes to block out their animation on their character. Okay, so those are some of the tools that you'll be using, but generally speaking, the graph editor is like the perfect place to get started before you start playing around with the other tools. Okay, Maya's material editor is called the the Hypershade. I'm sorry. So you go to your hotbox, go to Windows, and then you just go to, I believe, rendering editors, and then Hypershade. Okay, now this is your material editor. This is where all of your materials will show up. Let's go ahead and create a new material node. So I'm going to start with a Blinn. Now Blinn is like a very generic kind of material, so I'm just going to middle mouse drag that onto my mesh over here. Now I want to show you the attribute editor. So on the right side here, you can see we've got an attribute editor tab. You can actually toggle between the channel box and the attribute editor with Control A. So over here we've got the naming convention, so I'll just call it my material. You can call it whatever you want. We've got the color. Okay, just click the color, very straightforward. You can play around the transparency, the ambient color, or the incandescence, of course. There are other settings like bump mappings, great for adding normals in there. Just remember, when you create your bump mapping, you have to turn it into a tangent space normals. So if I were to create like just click the checkbox, this will create a new render node. I want a file, which is simply a normal maps file. I'm not going to add that in here right now. And just make sure you use as tangent space normals if you're going to be using a normal map. Okay. Down here is the work area. This is where your network or your shading networks will be shown. If you ever get lost, or if you ever want to see anything, you just right click and then go graph network. Okay, this will show you the relationship of the nodes that you currently have. So this is a bit more advanced. We're not going to get too much into this, but just to let you know that if you want to play around with the network nodes, there are so many different ways to create really cool looking textures. Okay, plenty of tutorials out there you can go ahead and take a look at. I'm going to create a new file node, so I'm just going to delete that. Let's go ahead and add a texture in here. I'm going to create a file. Okay, so now we have a file attached to the color. I want to go to the file node right here, and then the image name, we just go to the folders box here. I'm going to go to my desktop. I've got a bunch of textures. I might just add like a grunge texture. Now you can see we've got the sample here. If you were to click this, this will create what's called a swatch. A swatch is just a little tiny image that gives you a preview of what the material looks like. Alright, so now that's applied onto our scene already, you can see that we actually can't see the texture. That's because we have to press number 6. Now if you press 6, you can see that the texture will show up. There are multiple ways to show your renders, okay? So I'm going to go and create a light here very quickly. So let's just go and create a point light. So if I go to number 7, you can see how the light affects that, okay? I'm going to go Control D to duplicate that. And of course, if you want to play with the light colors, you can do that as well. Alright, but over here, if you go up to the top of your viewport, you can see you've got renderer. You can switch between default quality rendering, high quality, or viewport 2.0. Now in newer versions of Maya you have viewport 3.0 or viewport 4.0. I'm not actually sure what they're up to right now, but it's basically physical based renderer, okay? So it's a little bit more advanced. I typically don't use that because the end result or the end product I kind of know what it's going to look like, or I end up using other like render previews or physical based render previews like Marmoset Toolbag to like check my models and the materials. But you can go to high quality rendering if you want to take a look at the bump mapping, make sure that's all nice and neat and it works, or you can go to viewport 2.0 to get some good physical based quality rendering, okay? Typically they're just for preview purposes. You don't use that to render out your stuff unless you want to, for example, show a client like some basics on the the materials actually look like, okay? So you only use that as a very general reference of the progress you're making on the textures. So go to Window, and down here we've got UV Texture Editor, and basically this will allow you to play around or adjust or create your UV maps, okay? So because this is a polygon primitive, all polygon primitives already have pre-made UVs, okay? But 99% of the time you're going to need to go to the UV editor and then lay out your UV shells, okay? So there's a bunch of settings over here that you can play around. I've got toggle UV shaded display, so anything that's blue is basically the front. And if I were to, for example, just flip this backwards, okay, just invert it, you can see it actually adjusts the mesh in the viewport here. The red basically shows you the back, okay? So generally you want it blue when whatever you're doing. Okay, and it works in a similar way to how you would function, how it would function inside, for example, of the viewport. You got your component mode. Just go ahead and right-click, go to UV, and then have a play around with this. Okay, so if I were, for example, just to move certain parts around, you can see that's going to mess up my UV map a lot. Okay. So that's typically how the UV texture editor works. There are plenty of tutorials inside my channel if you want to learn how to create basic UV mapping. But all in all, the UV texture editor, you've got your very generic tools. For example, if I were to go to Edge and say I'm going to cut the edges here, I'm going to go ahead cut. And let's just turn on the UV borders. You can see where the borders are. You can go to your UV mode, select the UVs, shift and then shift and period or comma to increase or decrease the selection. Okay, this basically selects everything, and then you can move your UV shells around. Now if you want to unfold your UV shells, just go to polygons, go to unfold. We've got the options box here. As usual, I'm just going to reset it, and I'm going to make sure I pin selected UVs. Okay, so go ahead and apply, and now you can actually start unfolding your mesh, or let the computer unfold it. Okay, the computer's not going to get it right a lot. Okay, a lot of times it's going to mess it up. So, but that's why you need your human input. Okay, so you have to create seams and such. But again, you can press G to repeat the same setting, and then just unfold until you get something that you like. Okay. Of course, you can also rotate and move your UV map around. And this is the box that you want to keep all your UV shells in, okay, typically speaking. So whatever map you're going to create, that's what you do. Okay, next thing I want to show you is how to use the bone and skinning system. So let's go to our hotbox, and I'm going to go to skeleton, and then I'll go to joint tool. Let's tap the spacebar, and we're going to go to foreview. I'm going to go to the side here, and let's create a very basic bone system. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, the reason why I've actually created this slight bend here is because I want this bone system to have a preferred angle. Now, a preferred angle is very important because when it comes to IKs, then the computer needs to know what is the preferred angle. Otherwise, the bone will just explode. Okay, so when it comes to rigging, it can get a little bit messy. But for now, well, let's just go ahead and take a look at this example. So we've got a bone system inside of our little cylinder right here. Now there is a setting which you can use. Go to your shading, and then as you go down here you can see X-ray joints. X-ray joints basically allows you to see all the bones inside your model, okay? So this is very useful if you want to just gauge where the bones actually are. Now once we have the bones down, we're going to go ahead and skin it. So we just go ahead, select the bone, shift select the model, go to skin, and then I'm going to go to smooth bind. Let's take a look at the options box here. As always, you want to reset everything. Typically speaking, you want to start with like maximum of 2 influences, max influences, and then just go ahead and click apply. And that's basically it. So now you can actually select the bones and then bend them like so. Alright, now here's the issue. What if you actually need to paint the skin weights? Well, that's what Maya is great for. You can go down to skin, edit smooth skin. I'm just going to click or tear the dock off, and then let's go to paint skin weights tool. Okay, so click the square, and what you will see is that you'll get into the tool settings on the left side here, and this will basically represent the weights of each of the bones. Okay, so remember we've got 4 bones here, joints 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm not going to get too much into this, but I will give you a very quick example as to how to do some basic painting. Okay, so if you hold B and then left mouse drag, you can expand or shrink the brush size. Okay, so to start painting the weights on, you can go to replace or you can go to add. I typically like to use add in general just so that I can have more control. You can also go to smooth, or you can hold shift and smooth it, which does the same thing. Alright, but if you want to get a clean, nice weighting system or start painting your own weights, go down to normalize weights, turn it to interactive, click yes, go to the parent joint, which is number 1, and basically when you're in interactive, what happens is when you replace anything here, so if you look at joint number 2, you can see down here we've got a bit of blue. Okay, that basically means we've got some weighting on there. If I were to paint the value here as 1, okay, which is represented as white, and you go down to joint number 2, you can see that the color has actually been erased. In other words, anytime I add some weight in joint number 1, which is the parent, everything else will be erased on the other joints. When you do this in post, this doesn't happen in post, okay? So you can add something and you can see that it's still there. Alright, so joint 3, this basically overlaps, and it sort of normalizes each other out. So to start painting your weights, just go to your parent joint and then flood everything as 1. Alright, basically that means nothing is going to be moving except for the parent. So now you can actually start creating your own skin weights. So joint 2, say I want to paint over here. Okay, so just paint it all white, keep it nice and simple to start with as a blocking out method, and then joint 3 I'll just paint in the rest. Okay, actually I've kind of overlapped over here a little bit, but that's okay. And then from here we turn this back to post. You can also, one other thing is you can also lock these off, so lock it off and that way it won't be painted over even if you try it. Okay, so you can see that it doesn't really work. Oh, I'm actually in post, so let me try that again. But you guys kind of get the point, okay? So it's just a matter of playing around with this. Again, I have a tutorial in my channel if you need to know how to do some more advanced skinning. But this is just a very quick demonstration, and I've done a really bad job over here. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove this down to 0. Oops, that's the wrong one. There we go, much better. Okay, and then we'll just turn this to post. Hopefully that works fine, which it does. And then we just smooth everything. Okay, so flood smooth. And now we have some good skinning. So I can rotate this down. Now you can see we've got the skinning here. So it looks pretty good. That's great for like a finger or an elephant trunk. There are other ways to rig your character using bones, control systems, IK weights. That's not going to be covered here, but if you want to find more options when it comes to your rigging, your bones and such, go to your skeleton tool or go to your skinning tool right here. So you've got all the options right here that you can have a play around. Another thing you might also want to use is something called the IK handle tool, which very quickly I'll just go to the child node and the parent and then create an IK handle tool. Oh, sorry, IK handle, and I'll click the parent and then the child. And basically this will create a little modifier that allows you to like animated based on, well, based on just this little point on the end here. Okay, so that's inverse kinematics, whereas previously what you were seeing is FK. All right. Okay, next up is Cloth, and Cloth is a plugin that's already inside of Maya. It's relatively new to the 3D scene, but it's quite standard now, so I don't really consider it any different than any other 3D application, really. But Cloth inside of Maya is called NCloth, okay? So if we were to go to the tabs up here, you can go to the hotbox as well, so you've got NMesh. But I like to use the tabs, especially if you're just starting to learn Maya, so have a play around with some of these tabs over here. To create the NCloth, you can see we've got 3 separate objects. We've got the floor, a sphere, and the cloth that we're going to make. Simply select the cloth you want to make, and then just click the Give Selected Mesh and create an NCloth, okay? And then once you do that, you can see that it will create the NCloth, okay? Not much looks like has happened, but you can see inside the channel box or the attribute editor, quite a few extra things have been added. Now, one other thing is when it comes to simulation or any simulation in general, you want to go to your preferences and make sure the playback speed is at play every frame. The reason is because Maya can't simulate, especially when it's really complex, Maya can't simulate in real time in general, okay? So let's just go ahead and say this. By playing every single frame, what you do is you allow Maya to process every frame that happens, so you get accurate simulation, okay? And later on in more advanced tutorials, you can actually learn how to save your cloth simulation as a cache, and then that will play in real time without any simulation data. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to create the NCloth. You can see that it's quite simple. It's playing really fast because that's how fast Maya is actually playing it at. What I'm going to do is add maybe 600 frames here, and you can see that it's actually falling down, which basically means our NCloth is working perfectly. Okay, so what I wanted to do is actually I wanted to collide with objects. So I'm going to select the cloth, shift select every collider that I wanted to collide with, and then over here we can create a collision. Okay, so just go ahead and click that, and then we'll go ahead and play this, and you can see that it will collide with the objects that we have assigned. Okay, so let's go to my outliner here. Now, once you create an NCloth, it will create what's called a nucleus. A nucleus is simply a node that has a lot of the generic or global settings that will affect cloth. For example, gravity is one thing. So if I were to turn it to 98, and if I were to scroll down, let me go to scale attributes. I'm just going to turn space scale to 0.01. Okay, mainly because it's actually very small, and then I'm just going to play. Oh wow, that's actually a little bit too fast, so I'm going to go back here, and let me turn this down to 9.8, and then you can see that the cloth works a little bit more realistically. Now, of course, this is not in real time. This is playing much faster than real time, so you have to take that into account. But if we were to go to that cloth here, let's always go back to the first frame, okay? Because the simulation, if you were to, for example, scrub it inside the scene here and you try to go backwards, you can see it actually doesn't play. That's because Maya can only simulate forwards, okay? So if you want to get proper simulation, you want to go back to frame number 1, okay? Or frame 0 if you have it as that. And if we were to select this and go to our attributes editor, you can play around with some of the settings here. I'm not going to get into much of this, but we play around with things like the dynamics, stretch resistance, compression resistance. There's just a lot of little things that you can play around here to get some really good results. You can also go to the presets up here, and then say, for example, if you wanted it to be like, say, I don't know, we'll call it silk. Just go ahead and replace, and what this will do is it will replace all of the settings inside of the NCloth, and then you'll get a good silky kind of a result here. Okay, so you can see that the simulation plays a little bit differently than what we had before. So that's basically it for cloth simulation. Again, there's so much to go through. That's another monster in itself. You can go ahead and play around with some of the tutorials on the internet, or if you go into my channel, I've got some tutorials on how to do cloth. Okay, final thing before we finish up, and I'm going to show you how to render your work out. Render settings can be found in Windows. Go to your render editors and then render settings. Okay, so there are 3 things that you need to know about rendering. First is the render settings. Okay, this is one thing that you're going to be using very often. By default, you're probably going to be using Maya software, okay? Generally speaking, a lot of work these days you don't use that. This is like the bare basics of rendering. It's good for you just to preview like your scene but nothing more. You got other renderers here like Hardware 2.0 or Maya Vector. I typically don't go with that. I always use Mental Ray. Okay, so if you want nice renders that look good for the human eye, this is what you normally use. Okay, so Mental Ray is great, it's quite robust, but there are other renderers out there. For example, you've got V-Ray, which is quite popular. Okay, and each renderer will look slightly different. Okay, that's because the developers have created separate shaders. Mental Ray in and of itself has its own shaders as well. So if I were to go to Hypershade here, and I didn't cover this, I'm sorry, but if you go to MIS, sorry, you can see that this is Mental Ray enabled shaders. Okay, so these will only render inside Mental Ray. You won't find it inside, like, it won't render if you're using things like software mode. But you can play around with some of these materials. For example, the fast shader is great for like, I don't know, skin. Oh, sorry, the skin is great for skin and subsurface scattering, and then you got like things like metal and all that. V-Ray will have its own shaders as well, but remember, all these shaders will look slightly different depending on what renderer you're going to use. Okay, so just keep that in mind before you start rendering stuff. This will take some experience, of course. It is another monster in and of itself. Like I said, Maya is like a convergence point for a lot of elements to come together. Okay, so rendering is, again, just another prospect that you also have to learn. But in general, we've got render settings here. So I like to leave it on Mental Ray. You can create your own name. So I'll call this My Awesome Render. Image format, I like to use a PNG sequence. Now, if you are using 3D Studio Max, a lot of people tend to be like used to rendering out as an MOV. That's actually bad practice these days, so you typically always render an image sequence and then assemble it inside your post-production program. For example, things like After Effects or Nuke. Okay, so I'm going to leave it as PNG because it's a very generic, very robust file format. More advanced renders will make use of something called OpenEXR. Basically, it's a file that has all the render passes inside that one file. Okay, so it's an OpenEXR sequence. That's very useful for people who like to use Nuke, but also great for those who use After Effects as well. Okay, again, I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to leave it as PNG. Down here we've got frame and animation extension. If you're rendering an animation sequence, you want to make sure you change this to a number. Okay, so not single frame. You want to go down to something like name dot number. Okay, as you can see right here. I like to use name dash number, but that's my personal preference. You don't have to use that. And frame padding basically allows you to how many zeros you have depending on like the number of frames you have. Okay, so you can see the effect up here. So if I were to just like change it to like 4 or 10 or whatever, you can see we add a lot of zeros on the end. I just keep it at 3 because generally I don't render that many frames, sometimes 4, okay, it depends. Down here we've got start and end frame. So end frame is frame 10. Let's say if I want to render at 24 frames, that's what I can do. One other thing I didn't actually show you, which I'll show you very quickly, is to create a camera. So you go to create cameras and then camera. If I were to tap here, whoops, let me close that off. Let me just tap the spacebar. Tapping basically switches between the viewports. Okay, and what I'm going to do is first I'm going to move that sphere, and down here you can see we've got the camera. If I were to go to my viewport, and over here if I would go to panels and look through selected, what this will do, if I go press 6, is allow me to move into the view of the camera. Okay, so right now I actually have camera on. So this is the camera view, this is the perspective view. Now you can see the camera is actually moving in here. If I were to move it, you can see the camera will adjust itself based on what I do on this viewport. Okay, so let me just create a keyframe. Pressing S keyframes everything, and then go to frame 24 and then maybe move it over here. Okay, so this is the camera. What it will do is it will animate like so. Oops, I shouldn't have pressed played. And that's your animation. Alright, let's go back to our render. So go back to render settings. Now down here we've got resolution. Just make sure your renderable camera is camera 1. That's the one we created. I like to set the resolution at 1080, so HD 1080, but depending on what you want to render, you can set your own, of course. And then that's basically it. Over here you've got passes. This allows you to render the passes of your scene. Okay, so for example, you can render the specularity or the shadows separately, and it's great, especially when it comes to post-production. Just go ahead and create new render pass. I'm going to add ambient occlusion, beauty, ambient, diffuse, just a whole heap of other things. You can go ahead and play around with this. Maybe reflection. I don't really have reflection in this, so specularity and then just create. And for us to actually get that render, we need to create an associated pass with that. Okay, so just go ahead and click link, and this will basically tell you, yep, this is what is going to be rendering out. Okay, let's go to features. I like to turn on global illumination, or GI. Final gathering is usually needed, same as ambient occlusion, but typically you have your custom shaders to do that. Plenty of other settings you can play around here. Let's go to quality. Quality presets, I like to keep it at production. Production is usually a bit of an overkill for most projects, so just go to production, and then down here you've got reflections and refractions. I like to turn them down to 2. Same with max trace depth. Okay, this just speeds up rendering process. Once that's done, you can also play around with other things like global illumination, final gathering, like increase the accuracy and all that. I'm not going to get into that. Same with the ambient occlusion. And then you've got other options over here which you can also take a look at. Okay, and then once you're ready to render, you've got 2 ways to render. You can render a single frame. So what I've done is I've just pressed the render a single frame, which is by default it's usually page down on your keyboard. I've actually set mine to left parentheses. And what this will do is it will render the frame that you have right now. If you want to render the camera, of course you can go ahead and set that. That's still going actually, so I'm gonna just press escape. But you guys kind of get the idea. Okay, so this is just for preview purposes. You use render view or render a single frame just so that you can see what it actually looks like. Okay, typically you render at a lower resolution, so it's really fast. You get a good feel of what it looks like, and then as you get more and more confident, you go higher and higher resolution until you're ready to do the final rendering. Okay, so that's basically how the rendering process works. So that's the render view. This by itself is not going to render your image sequence. If we want to render our image sequence, we have to go down to our hotbox, go to render, and then go down to what's called batch render. Okay, when you go to batch render, I'm not going to do it now. What it does is it will, based on the settings you have here, okay, in other words, we're going to be rendering 24 frames, it will render everything out into that folder that we created in our desktop. So if I were to go to my desktop, go to my Maya project, and I go to images, this is where it's going to save all of your render passes. Okay, so it will render out the sequence of images and basically organize them inside folders. Once you're done with those renders, you basically grab those images and then bring them into like another folder for post-production. Okay, so this is where you find all of your stuff right here. Alright, and same deal with your scenes and everything else here. You can go ahead and take a look at that. Movies is where you actually have what's called a playback. So play blast, I'm sorry. So if you were to right click on your timeline here and go to play blast and then just go to the options box, this gives you a very simple, very quick render of your viewport. Okay, so this is great to do preview animations. It's great for visualization. All right, a lot of like studios do that so that they get an idea of whether or not the client likes the animation before it goes out to final rendering. Okay, so this is what a play blast does. It just does that for you in a very quick manner. All right, so have a play around with that. I think that's basically it. Those are the very basic tools that you'll be using inside of Maya.